We are back on the record at the beginning of media number 3 of Elizabeth Holmes. The time is 1:55.
Ms. Holmes, did you have any substantive conversations with the SEC staff during the break? Is that a no?
Yes,
Sorry.
correct.
Okay. So we were talking before the lunch break about the financials of the company and what you knew about how they were maintained and who was preparing them for prospective investors. Do you remember that?
I do.
Okay. Do you recall providing financial information to prospective investors in late 2014 showing Theranos on the road to achieving over $100 million in revenues?
I don't have specific memory of that, but I know we shared projections with investors in late 2014.
Do you recall providing financial information in August 2014 that indicated that Theranos was projected to make $140 million in revenues for 2014?
I don't remember that specifically.
Do you recall providing financial information to Fremont Group in October 2014 that indicated that Theranos was on track to make $126 million in revenues for 2014?
Again, I don't have specific memory of it.
Do you recall providing financial information to Capital in October 2014 that indicated that Theranos was on track to make $125 million in revenues for 2014?
No.
So I'm going to hand to you what's been previously marked as Theranos Exhibit 195. Exhibit 195 purports to be an October 13th, 2014 email from Sunny Balwani with a copy of Elizabeth Holmes, and subject line is re-thanks. And the starting dates number is BDT SEC _ PST 0004140, and there is an attachment with Bates number ending 4142. Have you seen Exhibit 195 before?
I don't recognize it, but I don't have reason to doubt it.
So you'll see here that Sunny Balwani is sending a financial model to Capital. Do you see that?
I do.
And the model is attached to the email. What was your understanding as to how Mr. Balwani came up with the financial projections?
I don't know.
Did he send these to you prior to sending them out, Capital?
I don't think so. I don't remember him doing that.
Do you recall discussing them with him before they were sent out to Capital?
No.
You understand that you're copied on the, I just want to clarify one thing, that you're copied on the email that appears at 195?
I just saw that, yeah.
Did you review this attachment at the time that you received the email?
I don't know.
So if you would turn to the income statement, which looks like 4 pages into the attachment, you'll see here that revenue for 2014 is projected to be $125 million in 2014. Do you see that?
I do.
And you'll see that there's a breakout for the revenues in 2014, and actually only $30 million is coming from U.S. retail pharmacies. Do you see that?
I do.
So U.S. retail pharmacies, would that be capturing the Walgreens and Safeway revenues that you were looking to achieve?
It could be. I don't know what this was specifically in this model.
You don't know what U.S. retail pharmacies is referring to?
Again, I don't remember going through any of the assumptions that went into this with Sunny, so I'm not sure exactly what he was referring to here.
Have you seen versions of the financial projections that that you were sending to prospective investors that look similar to this?
As I said earlier, I had in my mind the format that was in the Murdoch binder documents that you showed me, but I generally recognize this as a Theranos document.
Okay, so you have no idea as to how Mr. Balwani was breaking out the revenue streams for instance, U.S. retail pharmacies, physician offices, and hospitals, or what those categories were supposed to include or consist of?
I don't. I was just flipping back to the market assumptions page to look at what the assumptions were in here, which my assumption sitting here now would be that that's what this is based on.
Okay, so if you look at the market assumptions page, it looks like for retail pharmacy, so if you look at the first page of the document, retail pharmacy, you've got revenue per requisition and then the fully loaded cost system in RX. If you turn the page, you'll see that there are a number of assumptions related to the Walgreens and other retail pharmacy services. Do you see that?
I do.
I mean, can you think of anything else that retail pharmacies could mean other than the Walgreens and possibly Safeway relationships?
I don't know what he was thinking when he was creating this model. It looks here, just from reading this document sitting here, that he's assuming these are going to be Walgreens locations.
Okay, so looking back at the income statement then, before our lunch break, you had testified earlier that you believe that Mr. Balwani arrived at over $100 million in revenues in 2014 because he had included the $75 million accelerated innovation fee payment there. Do you remember that testimony?
What I was attempting to communicate was that the questions you were asking about the $108 million number and where it might have come from, I believed was associated with the Walgreens payment. I commented that I'm not sure about how revenue should have been recognized.
Okay, so here it doesn't look like that $75 million accelerated payment was included in Mr. Balwani's projection for 2014. Do you see that?
I do.
So do you know what the basis was for Mr. Balwani's projection of $125 million for 2014?
I do not.
I guess just looking at this, these projected revenue sources, it looks, $30 million about from retail pharmacies, which looking back looks like Walgreens. And then I think we talked earlier about the associated revenue from physicians' offices, hospitals, and pharma services. In late 2014, was this your expectation about how, whether meeting the gross numbers or not, just the sort of the breakdown of about a third from retail pharmacies, a tenth from physicians' offices, a little more than a third from hospitals? Was that in your mind how the revenue stream was going to look like?
I never thought about it that way specifically. I thought about it in terms of number of retail stores, and then assuming you had that footprint, what was a reasonable assumption of number of samples that could get sent to you by a given physician office or hospital group, and how many of those was it reasonable to assume you could get in a given geography.
So in that sort of assumption sample mind frame, did you assume that more samples were going to be run from hospital and pharma partners than were actually being run from just the operational Walgreens retail pharmacies?
I don't know. I don't know if I ever focused on what the differential would be between the two. I remember looking at both the number of store assumption as well as is it reasonable to pick up a certain number of samples per day from physician office groups, and was it reasonable to get a certain number of physician office groups, and focusing on that part of it.
What revenues had the company realized from physicians' offices by this time in October 2014?
I don't know.
Was there any?
I don't know. At some point, we started doing a pickup from physician offices. I don't know when it started.
Did you have any contracts with physicians' offices at this time?
I don't know. As referenced, we had a sales team in Arizona that was working on putting contracts in place with groups. I don't know the dates on those contracts with physician groups.
Would it surprise you if Theranos had no contracts with physicians' offices during this time?
I think generally, yes. I think we were, we believed that the relationships that we had in place would give us the ability to realize the assumed number of physician offices. So I generally thought that we had the relationships that we needed to be able to put this footprint in place.
What about from hospitals? Do you know how much in revenues Theranos had realized in revenues from hospitals up until October 2014?
I don't. Unless we had been doing the same type of pickup that we had started doing in physician offices that were part of hospital groups, I don't think there was any other financial income from hospitals at that point in time.
Do you know if Theranos was picking up samples from hospitals at this time?
I don't know when we started the pickups.
Did you start pickups with any hospital at any time?
I'm hesitating just because I think the word hospital here was referring to health systems, and some of the physician groups that we were working with may have been part of health systems. I don't know when those started and whether the physicians that we ultimately did that with were part of these health systems.
Okay, but do you remember Theranos ever starting to process samples from hospitals?
From physician groups that were affiliated with health systems, I believe we did.
Okay, but not from hospitals themselves?
So we were using, I think, the word hospital and health system interchangeably. So the group would have been associated with a hospital chain, as I understood it.
What are some of those physician groups?
So I think Commonwealth in Arizona was one of them, and there was another one, I'm trying to remember, there was another health system group, I don't remember the name, but I know that was something that very focused on in Arizona.
So you recall there were 2 physicians groups that Theranos was processing samples for?
I believe there were more than 2, I just don't know what all of them were.
I guess, was this conflation of hospitals and health systems sort of like the normal language at Theranos at the time, or is this something you just come to understand and read in the document now?
It's certainly something that I've come to understand now. I don't know at that time whether we use those words interchangeably.
Okay. I guess, so do you know that that's what hospitals meant in this model?
I don't know that. I'm assuming that.
Based on information you've gathered since this time?
Yes.
Who would know as to how much Theranos had realized in revenues from both physicians' offices and hospitals
As of October,
as of October
2014.
2014?
I would ask Sonny.
Sonny would know?
I don't know if he knows, but I mean, if I were trying to find that out and if I were still working with him, he'd be the first person that I would have asked.
Who else besides Sonny would know?
She would have known about what relationships we had in place with health systems or physician groups in Arizona. I don't think she had engagement on any of the national health system groups. She was focused only on local groups, so there were other chains like Dignity and others that had a national presence that we were hopeful we would be able to ultimately engage with. And she wouldn't have been involved, as I understand it, in interactions with them.
Okay, and so who would have been responsible for those other relationships besides the Arizona ones?
Sonny was.
Okay, let's go down to then pharmaceutical services. What had Theranos realized in the pharmaceutical service space in terms of revenues for 2014 by this time?
I don't know. I don't remember doing much on the pharmaceutical services side in 2014.
Did you have any contracts in place with any pharmaceutical companies at this time?
I don't know. I know that we had some relationships from our prior work that we were hopeful we were going to reconstitute. I don't know if there had been specific conversations with them or with the group I was referencing within Walgreens that was dedicated to working with pharma companies at that time.
What is your understanding as to the last year that Theranos received revenues from pharmaceutical companies?
So again, I want to be careful about payment and revenue because I know we received payments at certain periods of time and then there was discussion and revision about when to recognize them. I think the last years that we were paid was certainly prior to 14. And I don't know what year it was.
Would 2011 sound right to you?
I wouldn't be surprised if it's wrong.
You wouldn't be surprised if it's wrong?
Yeah, I don't know.
Okay. So you don't know at all when you might have received payments from the pharmaceutical companies?
When the last payments were? I don't. Again, if you said 2011, I wouldn't doubt it.
Who was responsible for those pharmaceutical company relationships in this time frame? If there was anyone.
So I don't know what this specifically is referring to here. If it was an assumption around the pharmaceutical relationships that Walgreens had been working to foster, then it would have been Walgreens' relationships with pharma companies. Otherwise, we had originally had a sales force that had relationship with the pharma companies. We then got rid of that sales force and built a new one that was retail focused. And had we reinstated those relationships, I don't know who we would have used. Sunny would have made that decision because it reported to him.
So you think that Sunny Balwani would have known about the status of the pharmaceutical relationships that Theranos had at this time?
I believe so.
So it sounds like Sunny Balwani would have known about the physician's office contracts that Theranos might have had, hospital system contracts, and the pharmaceutical service contracts. And Sunny was also involved in the Walgreens relationship and responsible for that as well. And that after a certain period of time, he was also responsible for the Safeway relationship. So what were you responsible for?
I was CEO of the company. From a technology perspective, was focused on inventions. I am named on a large number of our patents. I tried to contribute creatively to technical issues when we were dealing with technical issues that would require invention. I was very focused on the restructure to become a private company. I was focused on our vision and our strategy, and I ultimately became very focused on policy-related initiatives like the law change in Arizona and the work to try to bill Medicare at lower prices and the work to try to advocate for regulation of LDTs.
What was the last patent that you appeared on for Theranos?
I don't know. I'm still writing memoranda of invention right now.
So if you turn back to the macro market assumptions, which is the first page of the attachment, you'll see there's a list of, looks like device costs. So for 2014, the device cost is $40,000. For 2015, the device cost is $35,000. Do you see that?
I do.
What do these costs depict? What device are these costs for?
I don't know. Again, I didn't prepare this document. I'm not sure what these are referring to.
Was this consistent with the cost for a TSPU or a mini lab?
I don't know.
How much did it cost to manufacture a mini lab in 2014?
I don't know. I can tell you what it is right now. I don't know what it was then.
How much did it cost to purchase a Siemens Advia 1800 in 2014?
I don't know. I would assume it was more than $40,000, but I don't know.
Why do you make that assumption?
I just have general understanding that the Siemens equipment was expensive.
How did you gain that understanding?
Because we're trying to liquidate a lot of it right now, and I've generally been in touch with our operations teams on how much money we can get from it.
Did you know how expensive Siemens equipment was back in 2014?
I probably didn't know the exact amount, no.
Did you know that they were more expensive than the cost to manufacture a TSPU in 2014?
Yes,
And how did you know that back in 2014?
because I was generally aware of the cost of traditional lab equipment.
Can you think of any reason why the cost for a TSPU would be relevant to Theranos' projections for at the end of 2014?
I was just trying to look at that in here. I don't know if that was an assumption that we were building a certain number of devices for R&D. I don't know if that's in the R&D number. I don't know.
I mean, at the time, it wasn't Theranos' plan to. In your mind, in October of 2014, Theranos was still very much in phase 1 of its Walgreens rollout. Is that fair?
We were.
And you didn't have a specific date in mind at the time of when phase 2 would start. Is that fair?
I don't know. At that time, I know that we were just focused on engaging with FDA as much as we could to try to get the technologies through the FDA process. I don't know if we thought there was a specific date or not.
I guess in October of 2014, did you expect to move to phase 2 by the end of the year, by the end of 2014?
Again, I don't know exactly what my mindset was in 2014. I mean, sitting here now, don't think so, but I don't know.
So if you were still in the phase 1 part of the model with Walgreens, where you were continuing to use, for a majority of the tests, the modified version of commercially available machines, and there was some venous draw testing being done on referenced machines during that time as well, why wouldn't the device cost for a Siemens machine appear here under your assumptions?
Again, I didn't create this document. I don't know what was selected for the assumptions. I know Sunny was working interactively with team on trying to build models. I'm looking at it as we're talking and noting that this also includes things about number of Theranos units per hospital location in 2015. So it may have been associated with that assumption of phase 2. I don't know.
I guess in October of 2014, was Theranos planning on sending any TSPUs to any hospitals imminently?
We were planning on trying to get FDA clearance to do that. Again, I'm looking at this sitting here now and noting it says hospital location 2015. So I'm assuming sitting here now that the assumption in this document was that that would happen if we got FDA clearance in time to do so in 2015.
But you'll see that the assumptions also use a device cost in 2014 of $40,000. So I think Mr. Polakara's question is, were you aware that Theranos was imminently and in the last 2 months of 2014 going to be sending TSPUs to hospitals?
No, we had to get FDA clearance prior to doing that.
You always understood that Theranos needed FDA clearance of its TSPU before it could distribute them broadly, right?
Yes.
And did Sunny share that understanding with you?
I think so.
What's your basis for that understanding?
I'm trying to think of a specific conversation to answer that. It was my general understanding that that was our plan as a company, that the reason we were working so hard to get technology into the FDA was because it was required for phase 2 of our model.
Okay. Sitting here today, do you believe these assumptions about device costs and devices for hospitals could give a potential investor the impression that Theranos was using the TSPU for patient testing exclusively at the time?
I don't.
Why not?
Because we were so focused on the TSPU for phase 2. The only other thing I can think of here is that we might have been talking about building large numbers of them for use in our R&D and clinical studies. I don't know what else would have gone into it. I know, especially in this case, that there was very interactive engagement on the assumptions in the model, and I would have expected that there was very active discussion about these assumptions because I think they were trying to build their own model.
And, I mean, did you ever share with anyone if Theranos was using either modified or unmodified commercially available analyzers?
I don't know. I don't know.
So if we turn to the next page, the Theranos market assumptions page, you'll see that there are some assumptions here for Walgreens, and there's other RX locations. What did you understand the other RX locations to be referring to here?
Some other retail pharmacy beside Walgreens.
Okay, so what other contracts did you have in place at this time other than Walgreens? Wouldn't that be Safeway?
Yes, we had the Safeway relationship in place.
Okay, so do you think that the other would have been referring to Safeway?
It could have been. Again, I don't know.
If you look at the Walgreens line, the assumptions here for December 14 is that Theranos services would have been rolled out to Walgreens stores in 300 locations. Do you see that?
Yes.
Is that consistent with your understanding of where things were headed with the Walgreens relationship, that by December 2014, Theranos services would have been offered at 300 stores?
I generally remember that at that time we were really focused on rapidly ramping. I don't know if 300 was the number that we thought we would be at by the end of the year.
Okay. So we talked in your earlier testimony about how at some point the parties were renegotiating the contract. And those talks started happening, and that the last store actually opened in the fall of 2014. Do you remember that testimony?
I do.
Okay. So do you think that it was achievable to open 300 stores, a month later after opening the last 41st store?
Again, I don't know what was behind these numbers in this model. I know that through the end of 14, I continued to believe that there was an opportunity to ramp rapidly with Walgreens. I don't know what the specific numbers that we were thinking at that time was.
And then you remember your earlier testimony in which we established that by December 2014, the parties were talking about converting the business model to a rental agreement model. Do you remember that?
I do.
Okay, and so that would have required some modification of the contract if it came to pass, correct?
Correct.
Okay. So if you turn the page to the next page, you'll see that by December 2015, the assumption was that Theranos services would be rolled out to 900 stores. Do you think that was reasonable in light of the fact that the parties were just beginning to talk about the rental agreement model in December 2014?
I do.
Why?
Because Walgreens used to refer to itself as an execution machine. They rolled out injections for vaccines in 8,100 stores in 12 months. We thought that you could roll out nationally within 12 to 18 months of the time you made a decision to do that.
So turning back to the store assumptions for the end of 2014, did Mr. Balwani ever tell you that he expected Theranos to open 200 Walgreens locations by November 2014 or 300 by the end of the year?
I don't remember specific conversations about those numbers. I remember feeling generally optimistic going into the fall of 14 that we were going to be ramping quickly.
When did that optimism fade in your mind?
I don't know that it ever faded. I mean, looking at the notes from the December meeting with Walgreens, the fact that they were endorsing the kind of model that we wanted to pursue, we continued to see as a really positive sign.
So you'll see, turning back to the first market assumptions page, So we just talked about how other was likely Safeway, since Theranos had no other contracts with other retail pharmacies, correct?
Again, I don't know what Sonny was thinking when he built this model. I can sit here and guess, but I don't know.
But Theranos didn't have any other contracts with other retail pharmacies at this time besides Walgreens and Safeway, correct?
Not that were signed.
Okay. So do you, based on what we saw before and the fact that things had slowed down with Safeway and the parties seemed to be disagreeing on a number of issues, do you think it was reasonable to think that 135 stores would be rolling out in Safeway with Theranos services in January 2015?
I don't know that this was Safeway.
Who else could it be?
Well, I don't know what the date of this was. The Walton family had just, I think by this time, invested. We were in talks with executives at Walmart about the potential to roll out there. We still had really good relationships with others from the grocery network at Safeway who wanted to work with us if it didn't have to be from Safeway. I genuinely don't know what this was referring to.
But you didn't have any contracts with any other retail pharmacy besides Walgreens and Safeway. What would make you believe that in October 2014 you'd be able to open 135 stores, wellness centers, in January 2015? That's 3 months away.
Well, she just answered your question.
I don't know what this assumption was based on. I do know that by this point in time, we'd spent years working with, in terms of meetings, there wasn't a physical contract in place, multiple retailers on what this could look like, and I don't know what Sonny was thinking when he put this together or what its purpose was.
Okay, so we're not asking you to speculate here. So if you don't know, then you can just state that you don't know. So you have no idea as to how these assumptions came
She's
about.
answered
I
your
do
question.
not know.
Okay.
So you mentioned the conversations with Walmart. What was your view of the initial conversations with the Walmart folks?
My understanding was that first the people affiliated with the Walton family wanted to understand whether Walmart thought that this could be valuable and a potentially viable business model, and then wanted to understand whether there was any conflict with them investing if Walmart at some point was to proceed with this. And I believe both of those things turned out positively, that Walmart thought that there was potential here and that it was also okay for the Walton family to invest.
In other words, there was potential, but I guess specifics of a framework for agreement weren't being discussed in October 2014, were they?
I don't know. Well, Walmart had a team of executives that came to Theranos, and we had specific conversations about what a pilot could look like and how many stores and these types of things. I sitting here now, think that that probably would have required follow-up with other retailers, but I know that we generally believed that based on having had years of interactions with multiple retailers, there were opportunities to engage with other retailers quickly if we needed or wanted to do that.
And with CVS, in October of 2014, had you shared with Walgreens the potential for a contract with CVS on any retail pharmacy locations?
I think we talked a lot with people at Walgreens about whether or not we would engage with CVS and trying to be respectful of the fact that Walgreens wanted us not to, but also trying to say to them, unless we get the kind of rollout that you described to us, we're going to need to have another partner.
Do you recall personally having any of those conversations?
I don't know whether I did or not. I'm not sure.
So if you look down on that first page again of the market assumptions page, do you see that?
I'm sorry,
The first page,
yes.
yeah. You'll see there's a line here called RX tests per day per location. Is that requisitions per day per location?
I think so.
And is that a good proxy for patients per day per location?
I don't know. I'm just trying to look at what's underneath it. I think it could be.
Okay, so here in the assumptions, it looks like Mr. Balwani is using 40 for October 2014, and In fact, I think that stays pretty constant through December 2015 if you look on the next page. So do you remember your earlier testimony that you had seen a document showing that Walgreens was actually seeing about 3 patients per store per day in 2014?
Tests and patients are different, totally different.
I don't. Do you understand my question?
I don't. I'm sorry. Could you clarify?
My question was, do you remember your earlier testimony in which we discussed that by May 2014 you were aware that Walgreens was seeing 3 patients per store per day?
I remember the document that you showed me. I don't know if I was aware of that at that time.
Okay, and then also you said that you were aware that Walgreens was trying, or the goal for Walgreens was to reach 10 patients per store per day. Do you remember that?
Yes.
Okay, do you think it was reasonable for these financials to be assuming that Walgreens would have seen or would be seeing 40 patients per day in the stores by October 2014?
Again, I'm not sure if this is patients per day because it says tests per day, and I'm not exactly sure what that means. I do know that our numbers ultimately crossed in the stores that were in the right locations, I believe above 60 patients per day and higher. So if this is patients per day, then yes.
RX, what does that mean to you?
It means prescription or pharmacy. I don't know.
Okay, and so, I mean, 40 tests per day, that would seem pretty low, don't you think?
I'm just saying I don't know why it says tests as opposed to patients. If it said patients, I would assume it would say, if he meant patients, I would assume he would write patients. I don't know.
But don't you think that 40 tests per day per location, that would seem a little bit low to you, right?
In terms of what?
It would seem a little bit low to be using an assumption of 40 tests per day per location.
I don't know. I don't know what assumptions were going into this and what it was based on. As I said, I know that we ultimately saw more than 60 patients per day in a number of locations that were the models for how we thought we were going to be rolling out.
And at the time, did you have a sense of how many tests each of those patients ordered on average?
I don't know what my understanding was at the time. I generally understand now that there was about 3.2 CPT codes per order on average.
Did you have any understanding at the time about how the patients per day translated in terms of numbers of tests Theranos had to actually run?
At that time?
Right.
I'm not sure. Yeah, I generally understood that as Sonny built models, he tried to study what other laboratories were doing and seeing in terms of number of patients per day and other metrics. So I believed that he was judging assumptions in general based on that research.
So if you turn back to the first page of the macro market assumptions,
Yep.
you'll see under retail pharmacy, the revenue per requisition is $40. We were just talking about how Theranos was looking to offer tests for $4. Does that seem a little high to you?
I think it depends on how many tests are assumed in that requisition.
Okay, so then do you think based on these numbers that actually, because as you can tell, 40 is being multiplied by the 41, the 40, 41 locations, Walgreens locations, and also another 40 tests per day per location. So do you think that maybe RX test actually does mean a requisition?
I'm sorry, I didn't follow you. You said 40 is being multiplied by what?
So if you see what Mr. Valwani is doing here, he's multiplying the number of locations for Walgreens of 41 in October of 2014
Yep.
by the number of tests per day per location, by the amount of money that you're receiving per requisition in order to get to the revenue figures.
Where is that?
Here's the she's directing you.
So it's the number of
Pick one of those
stores.
columns.
Yeah.
She's saying that you got 41 times 40 equals 1,600. That's what you're pointing
Right.
to.
But then I think you
And if you
also
multi-
said, yeah.
And if you multiply that again by the amount of money that you're receiving per requisition, you would get the revenue figure of 1.968.
Okay.
So do you think it makes sense then that RX test is actually a requisition?
It could be.
Okay. So you don't know one way or the other how these assumptions came about?
Mm-hmm.
I don't. Again, I was not involved in setting these.
Do you have any concerns about these having been provided to potential investors? You know, if you were involved in preparing them, these went out under the Theranos name and were provided to potential investors. Does that give you any pause?
I don't know that they were provided to potential investors. I see they were going back and forth with year. I don't know what the context of sending these to was, whether this was in the context of interactive engagement on building a model or not. I don't recognize this as the format of the final model.
If something similar had been provided to other investors at the time, would that, or around the time, would that give you any concern?
It depends on what the assumptions were based on. Right?
If the same assumptions were used, would that concern you?
The same assumptions as this,
Yes.
meaning 40 patients per day and $40 requisition?
Yes. And the 300 Walgreens stores by the end of 2014 and 900 by 2015. Would any of that give you pause?
I don't think that 900 by 2015 would have given me pause. 40 patients per day, sitting here now, given that I know that we beat that number in the right stores, that would not have given me pause. The requisition of $40, I don't know how many tests that was assuming, but I know that our per requisition income was higher than $40.
Well, so you say that you knew that some stores were receiving 60 patients per day. Were you also aware that some stores...
Later, I don't know if it was at this time.
Oh, okay.
Do you have a sense of when you came to kind of a more granular patients per store understanding?
I think it was in 2015.
Can you say just geographically when, like early 2015, late 2015?
I'm not sure. I'm not sure. I mean, by late 2015, we were completely focused on engagement with CMS and FDA and the Wall Street Journal. So I would think at least middle of 2015. I don't know how early in 2015.
You can put that one aside. I'm going to hand to you what was previously marked as Theranos Exhibit 213.
Yep.
Exhibit 213, we had talked about earlier in your testimony, but you'll see that the first page,
So I'm sorry, I got, is this the document you just handed in?
No.
No.
Oh, you're going back to
Yeah.
one that was
Yeah.
earlier marked today?
Yes.
Yeah.
Or not today,
Marked
but on
yesterday,
Tuesday.
okay,
Yeah.
Tuesday.
So you'll see the first page is called Theranos Confidential Summary Capitalization.
Yes.
And then there's some financial information in the back. So I represented to you at the time that we marked this exhibit that this was produced by Theranos to the SEC pursuant to subpoena as part of a binder that was provided by Theranos to Rupert Murdoch when he was considering whether to invest in Theranos in December 2014 and January 2015. So if you turn to the projected statement of income, which is 605. You'll see here that this document is projecting almost $1 billion of revenue in 2015 and almost $2 billion in revenue in 2016. Do you see that?
I do.
Okay. And if you turn back to the market assumptions page, oh, I'm sorry. I will be giving that to you just shortly. But just so that you have this in front of you, you'll see that half of the revenues from 2015 and 2016 are from the retail pharmacy business. Do you see that?
I do.
Okay. Do you know what assumptions were used to get to those numbers? $425 million in 2015 and $993 million in 2016?
I don't, sitting here now.
Okay.
Just looking further down the page, you see there's a number that's listed next to EBITDA. EV.
Yes.
Did you have an understanding in late 2014 of what that number meant?
I don't know. I don't think I focused on that. I don't know.
Do you understand today what it means?
I understand that it's our earnings, and I think that percent margin means our profit margin.
Did you have an expectation in late 2014 that Theranos would have $300 million, over $300 million in earnings at the end of 2015?
I think that I believed in whatever assumptions went into getting this kind of footprint, and understood from the model that if we did that, we would be profitable.
You see an item below that about depreciation?
Mm-hmm.
Sorry, was that a yes?
I do. I see it, yes.
Sorry. Do you have an understanding of what's being depreciated there?
No.
Okay. So I'm going to hand to you what's been marked as Theranos Exhibit 228, and you can keep Exhibit 213 in front of you. Exhibit 228 purports to be an Excel spreadsheet. On the first page, there is a screenshot of the metadata that's associated with this file, and on the second page is where the actual document starts. The title is on the top of the first page is Theranos Confidential Market Assumptions with starting dates number THER-2550987. Have you seen Exhibit 228 before, besides the first page, which includes the metadata?
I don't know.
Okay. I'll represent to you that this is the Excel spreadsheet that was produced by Theranos to the SEC pursuant to subpoena and represented by counsel to the SEC to be the financial model that produced the financial statements that are in the Rupert Murdoch binder. So that would be Exhibit 213. So if you look at the projected statement of income, which is on the third to last page of the document,
Yes.
you can go ahead and compare that to what you're seeing on that same page in Exhibit 213. Do they look identical to you?
They do without the highlighting or whatever this is.
Do the numbers look identical to you?
They do.
Okay. Why don't you turn back to the market assumptions page, which is the of Exhibit 228. I'm sorry, why don't you turn to this? Oh, you're already on that page. So on this page, this would be the second market assumptions page. You'll see here, instead of projecting 900 stores for Walgreens in December 2015, now the projection is 1,340 stores in December 2015. Do you see that?
I do.
Do you know why this projection changed from 900 to 1,340 in the space of 2 months?
I don't.
I think Mr. Balwani would be the best person to answer that question.
Yes.
Okay, and then also you'll see that instead of opening 135 other stores in January 2015, now the assumptions are that 135 stores will be open in April 2015. Do you see that?
I do.
Why do you think this change was made?
I don't know.
And then if you look further down, under retail pharmacies, there's some assumptions related to the physicians' offices and retail clinics. Do you see that?
Yes.
So in March 2015, the assumption for the number of physicians' offices is 500. Do you see that?
I do.
What was the basis for believing that Theranos would be in contract with 500 physicians' offices by March 2015?
I don't know specifically. Sitting here now looking at it, I'm assuming there was some type of tie to being at 100 retail locations by that time.
What was the relationship between the retail locations and the doctors?
My general understanding has been that once we had a certain retail footprint, around that retail footprint, we would then be able to contract with physician offices both to send people to the stores as well as to pick up samples.
And that was your understanding in late 2014?
I think so, yes.
Okay, so if you look at hospitals, there are some assumptions there as well. And for January 2015, the assumption is that there would be 10 sites that would be using Theranos services. Do you know what that relates to?
I do not.
Okay, so if you turn back to Exhibit 213 then. And turn to page with dates ending 607. You'll
Yes.
see there are a number of additional comments at the bottom of the page, like footnotes. Do you see them?
I do.
Okay, and the first one says, please note all revenue projections are based on contracts already signed and in place for 2015 and 2016. No additional contracts are assumed signed. Do you see that?
I do.
And then if you go down to number 3 here, it says Theranos has an exclusive contract with second largest grocery chain in the U.S. to be the only lab in those locations. Was that referring to Safeway?
I don't know.
So would you agree, though, that investors who would be receiving these financial statements, including Rupert Murdoch, would believe that these numbers were based on already signed contracts, based on these additional comments?
I don't think, I can't speak for them. Our understanding was that we engaged very directly with any questions that investors had about what was important to them in evaluating the investment.
But you, if you had received these, would you understand then, based on these comments on this page, that the revenue projections were based on contracts already signed by Theranos?
I don't know. I'm reflecting in my head on the kind of conversations that happened with investors around their investment in the company, and we were very open about the state of our relationships with retail pharmacy partners.
Okay, what about other businesses like hospitals and physicians' offices? Were you very forthright with investors about those contracts as well?
My understanding is that we generally discussed the fact that Intermountain and Dignity had invested through peer, and that we thought that there was opportunity to engage with them in providing services because they had an investment, and that therefore we would be able to rapidly do that as soon as we were ready.
Besides Intermountain and Dignity, what other hospitals did Theranos have contracts with?
I don't know. As I said earlier, I know that there was work in Arizona to engage with what I was calling hospitals or health systems. I don't know by memory which ones the company ultimately signed contracts with.
Do you recall discussing Exhibit 213 with Mr. Murdoch and his associates?
I don't recall discussing this specifically. I know after he invested, we had discussions about what we thought we could do financially in terms of projections.
What do you mean by that? When do you think he invested?
It's my memory that he communicated that he wanted to invest as early as, I want to say October, but that's probably wrong specifically, and we later sent him all these materials. I had a couple meetings with him after he invested, I think in early 2015, and generally discussed, what we thought the potential was for number of stores and associated revenue. That's the only time I can remember specifically discussing numbers with him.
So just so I understand, is it your general understanding that you only discussed sort of the financial potential of the company after he had actually invested in Theranos?
That's the only time that I personally can remember talking about it with him. He came to Theranos before he invested, and Sonny was in the meeting, and I can't remember if financials were discussed in that meeting or not. But I remember after he invested, sort of having a conversation about how do you think you're doing, and talking about the challenges in rolling out in retail and what we thought we were going to be able to do or make up.
You mentioned a sort of a meeting with him and his son before he invested. Do you remember any other in-person meetings with Mr. Murdoch at Theranos before he invested?
I don't remember any other meetings at Theranos.
What other meetings do you recall?
The first time I met him, and then when he decided to invest, which was a meeting at his ranch near San Francisco.
Do you recall Sonny ever telling Mr. Murdoch anything about the financial possibilities of the company?
Again, I know he was in a meeting with Rupert, and I can't remember exactly whether Sonny presented on the financials there or not, or just discussed them. I'm not sure.
Were you present for that meeting, I guess, or are you?
I was.
Okay.
I was.
So,
Yeah.
so if Sonny had presented something, you would have been in attendance at least.
I was. Yes.
What was the company's cash balance as of the end of 2013?
I believe we received the $75 million payment from Walgreens right at the end of 2013, so I think it was at least $75 million.
Okay. Were you aware that the company was running out of money at that time?
Yes.
Okay. And was that part of the reason why Theranos wanted to accelerate the innovation fee payments from Walgreens?
I think the initial reason for trying to accelerate the innovation fee payments from Walgreens is that we were investing a lot of money into the Walgreens relationship, and it was not going to be sustainable if they didn't make this payment. So that was the primary driver for it.
Okay. Was it also part of the reason why you ended up going out to raise more capital from investors?
I'm sorry, was what?
Was the fact that the company was running out of money at the end of 2013 also the reason why you went out to raise more capital from investors?
The raises happened after that, so by that time we'd received the payment from Walgreens and we didn't need capital to continue operations.
What was your burn rate on cash per month in that time frame?
I don't know.
Do you think it was something like $10 million
In early 14?
in early 14?
I don't know.
So even if you had, say, $75 million from Walgreens, that would likely only last, say, a year maybe at most? Is that consistent with what you would understand?
No, I mean, the payment of the 75 from Walgreens to us meant we were going to be expanding nationally. So at that point, we thought financially the company was in a strong position.
So why did Theranos engage with Partner Fund around the late 2013, early 2014 period in connection with an investment?
Partner Fund was introduced to us as someone who was interested in investing, and our first meeting with them was in, I think, December of 2013.
Yeah,
But is your testimony today that sort of their potential investment was not viewed as a potential source of operating capital in your mind?
I believe, and I'm speculating a bit here, but knowing now that the first meeting was around December 10th, we certainly wouldn't have expected that we would be closing investment from them before the end of December. I think we thought that our business lived on getting payment from Walgreens, and then it was really a question of, was PFM going to be the kind of long-term investor that we wanted to begin to bring in? Because at that point, not only did we have the payment from Walgreens, we also had some capital from existing shareholders that had been invested.
So I'm going to hand back to you, and you can put those two exhibits away, but I'm going to hand back to you what was previously marked.
We've been going with over an hour.
There's actually just one thing I want to look at
Okay,
in here.
all right.
So this is exhibit 221 that I'm handing over to you.
This is the same one?
Yes,
Yeah,
these
okay.
are the text messages between you and Mr. Balwani.
Yes.
So if you can turn to the page with date sending 6263.
6263. Yes.
So you'll see towards the bottom of the page, there is a text message from Sunny Balwani on November 21st, 2013 at 5:35. And he says, you should make yourself comfortable with financial models. Alternatively, you can cover everything else and I can meet with him on Tuesday and answer any questions. Do you see that?
Yes.
And then a couple text messages down, you say, I'll get myself comfortable, let me know what file to use. And then if you go on to the next page, which is 6264, there's a number of redactions, but about 6 messages down, there's another text message from Mr. Balwani to you, and he says, please close the file under DST folder under Fin, not safe to give him yet. and then another message where he says under DST, and then a few more messages down, you respond to him, can I edit it? There are typos, okay to open. Do you see that?
I do.
What do you recall about what was going on here?
I'm not sure.
Does it look like you were opening a file on Mr. Balwani's folder in order to edit some files?
It looks like I was opening a file under his folder, yes. I don't know if I edited it.
What is DST?
I think this refers to,
Did you understand them to be a potential investor in Theranos at this time?
I think so. Yeah.
So do you think that you opened the file and reviewed it at the time?
I don't know.
Does it look like you did? Mr. Balwani says, please close the file.
I'm sorry, where does he say that?
On 6264 at 5:38 p.m.
I don't know.
Were there other instances in which you might have opened a file and reviewed it?
Yes.
And other instances in which you might have opened a financial model that Sunny Balwani was working on and reviewed it?
Could have been.
Do you recall any instance in which you edited a financial model that he was working on?
No.
Okay, we can take a short break. We're off the record at 3:03 p.m.
We are back on the record at 3:25.
Ms. Holmes, did you have any substantive conversations with the SEC staff during the break?
No.
So I want to switch gears again, and now we're going to talk about Theranos' communications with FDA. Do you recall communications that Theranos had with FDA that started in 2012?
Yes.
Why did you start having those conversations with the agency?
Do you mean generally or the ones in 2012 specifically?
The ones in 2012 specifically.
I believe FDA had questions about information that they had heard about Theranos, and we wanted to answer their questions and give them any information on our work that they wanted.
What questions did they have?
I think that they thought that we were trying to sell our devices to other laboratories at the time, and we tried to immediately convey to them that we weren't, and that we had actually hoped to come in and start working with them when our lab-developed tests came live, and that we were hopeful that we could take them through the regulatory process.
And so why did the FDA have these questions? Did somebody bring a concern to their attention?
I think there was a miscommunication with people that we had been interacting with in DoD.
In the Department of Defense?
Yes.
What information would the DoD have given FDA with respect to or concerning Theranos' possible sale of devices?
I don't know what information they gave the FDA.
What were your talks with the DoD about that led to DoD contacting FDA?
I actually don't know why DoD contacted the FDA. I'm not sure.
I'm going to hand to you what's been marked Theranos Exhibit 229. Sorry. Exhibit 229 purports to be a letter with Hyman Phelps and McNamara letterhead dated November 26, 2013. The letter is addressed to the FDA, and the starting date's number is TS-0995690. Have you seen Exhibit 229 before?
You know, I don't remember this letter specifically, but I recognize the letterhead as
Do you remember having discussions with Hyman Phelps about sending a letter to FDA in this time frame?
I have to read the letter to remember exactly what this was referring to, but I know that it was one of our regulatory counsel that was advising us as we were engaging with the FDA in 2013.
How generally would you communicate with the FDA? Would you include regulatory counsel, or would you have discussions with FDA directly?
I think both.
Okay, and on what occasions would you be having direct conversations with FDA versus having your law firm communicate with them?
The first one that comes to mind is we would have interactive review with their teams, and in that context we were directly engaged. We may have had in-house regulatory counsel involved in that, but generally not outside regulatory counsel.
Would you expect that a law firm that you hired would discuss with you the possibility of sending a letter to FDA before doing so?
Yes.
Okay, and would you expect that that law firm would also discuss what they were planning to say to the FDA before going ahead and communicating with FDA?
On behalf of Theranos?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, so do you have any reason to doubt that you knew at the time that Hyman Phelps was sending this letter to FDA?
No.
So if you turn to the attachment to the letter, which starts on 700,
Yes.
you'll see that the attachment is some meeting minutes for a meeting on October 15th, 2012, and the minutes themselves are dated November 16th, 2012. Do you see that?
Yes.
Were you present at this meeting in October 15th, 2012?
Yes.
So it was a meeting between Theranos then and CDRH, correct?
Yes.
And in
I
this,
didn't know they were CDRH. I thought of them as FDA, but I see that here.
okay. That's fine. So you understood that you were at a meeting on this date with the FDA?
Yes.
Okay. And your counsel wasn't involved in this meeting, right?
They were not present at the meeting
Why not?
because we wanted to directly engage with the FDA.
Just a second, I mean, to the extent that, I mean, you can answer that, but I mean, to the extent that you're asking for communications that you had with counsel about what your strategy was and why they showed up, then you shouldn't answer that.
Right,
So,
and I'm not asking, I'm not asking about your conversations with counsel, but I'm wondering if you can answer the question why you didn't include regulatory counsel in that meeting.
I think in general we wanted to directly engage with people at the agency.
Okay. So, do you recall this meeting?
Yes.
Okay, what was discussed?
My memory is first their explicit concerns based on information that they had heard, and then secondly, we attempted to communicate that we really wanted to engage successfully with the FDA and try to create a model for becoming the first company to take all their LDTs through the FDA process.
Okay, so if you look at the first page of these minutes on 700, oh, and actually before we look at that, do you know who drafted these minutes?
Someone at the FDA.
Okay, so if you look in that first paragraph, following the following information is meant to summarize the issues raised at the meeting. The first bigger paragraph starting with FDA. About halfway through the paragraph it says, it was stated very early in the meeting that the FDA does not consider the assays to be ASRs and distribution of the Theranos system, analyzer, and reagents in the US as an LDT is not appropriate. Do you remember them telling you that?
I don't remember this communication of this sentence specifically.
Do you remember them telling you that they did not believe that Theranos' system and its reagents would be considered LDTs?
I remember them saying that if we were commercially distributing the device, that would not be an LDT, but that if we were running the tests in our lab, that would be an LDT.
Okay, it goes on to say, Theranos was also informed that many of the potential assays that could be used on their analyzer are nucleic acid based or are classified as class 2 or class 3. Therefore, classification of the instrument as a class 1 device is incorrect and requires pre-market clearance or approval for marketing in the United States. You see that?
I do.
Did they tell you that your assays would be classified as class 2 and class 3 and wouldn't be considered a class 1 device?
If I am reading this correctly, sitting here now, I think it's referring to the fact that the device would be classified according to whatever test you were pursuing clearance with.
Okay, but did you understand here then that they were telling you that because the assays were not considered class 1 devices, that the system as well wouldn't be considered a class 1 device?
I don't remember thinking about this at the time. Sitting here now, I interpret it as if you file for clearance on one of these assays, the whole test system is going to be classified according to the classification of the assay.
Okay, but in any case, it looks like because of the types of assays that Theranos was thinking of performing on its device, it was likely that they were not going to be considered class 1 devices. Isn't that what they told you?
Again, I don't remember the specific part of the discussion with them.
I mean, at the time you understood what a nucleic acid-based assay was, right?
Yes.
And I mean, for a layman, is it fair to say that those are more complicated than than other types of assays? Or did you have an understanding that they were generally run on class 2 devices at the time?
Again, I'm not sure about this part of the discussion. I don't have specific memory of it. I believe that this is essentially saying that nucleic acid tests in general are class 2 or class 3, and therefore, if you file a piece of hardware with those chemistries, that piece of hardware will be treated in the same way as the chemistry is treated.
Okay, and I guess leaving that meeting with the FDA, did you have that understanding that the type of assay would dictate what sort of class treatment the approval that you were seeking from the FDA would require for the assays?
Yes, and not necessarily the type of assay, but the specific assay itself. For example, yep.
I'm sorry, I was using type of assay because that's the only way I could think about it, but I think I understand your answer.
Okay, and then in the second paragraph, towards the bottom of the page, you'll see there's a sentence that starts, however. Do you see that?
Yes.
And it says, however, it was pointed out that the deployment of Theranos systems for research or investigational use at U.S. military facilities in Afghanistan for evaluation purposes is acceptable and does not violate any regulations as long as the results obtained during the evaluation are strictly not used for patient diagnosis and management. And Theranos follows required labeling regulations stated in CFR 21-809.10. So here, Theranos had told you that it was fine to use the Theranos system for research purposes, but not fine to use it for patient testing. Is that what you understand as to what they told you at this
You
meeting?
said Theranos.
Yeah.
You want to restate
Oh,
that?
I'm sorry. So here, it seems that the FDA is telling you that it was fine to use a Theranos system for research purposes, but not for patient diagnosis. Is that what you understood that they told you that day?
No, it's not.
What is your understanding?
My understanding was that the majority of the meeting was based on a discussion about what an LDT is, and that our tests were able to be used as LDTs so long as they were in the same facility that they were developed, but that to the extent they would be distributed, they would no longer be LDTs based on the commentary in this meeting.
Okay, but you agree that that's not exactly what is being written in these minutes, right?
Do you mind if I take a minute just to look at this document?
Sure.
Yeah, if you look on the first page where it says, as Theranos has established a CLIA-certified laboratory in Palo Alto, under enforcement discretion, use of a test developed and validated by the laboratory and which meets the definition of an LDT can be performed on clinical samples which are shipped back to the CLIA lab in Palo Alto, and results can then be transmitted to an ordering physician.
So what was your understanding from that?
That this model was consistent with FDA's enforcement discretion for laboratory developed tests.
Okay, so how do you square that with what FDA then subsequently writes here, which is that it's fine to use the system for research purposes, but not for diagnosis purposes?
It was my understanding that those are two different discussion topics. The specific discussion about investigational use was with respect to distributing the devices for use in a U.S. military facility outside of the U.S.
So you're saying that FDA told you that it was fine to have the device here in the U.S., but it was not fine to ship it overseas for patient diagnosis?
No.
What's the distinction?
My understanding is that FDA was saying that distribution of the device in the U.S. makes it not an LDT, that distribution of the device in the U.S. or outside of the U.S. could be done in an investigational basis, and that the sentence that I just read was consistent with their enforcement discretion for LDTs.
Okay. Why don't we go on to the paragraph that starts to move forward. It's the second full paragraph down on 701. So it says, to move forward with the regulatory process, the agency recommended that for their first submission, Theranos should pick an analyte or a panel of analytes that may be of interest to DoD and proceed to work interactively with the agency to develop a regulatory pathway to achieve pre-market clearance approval status. So FDA here was telling you that you did need to achieve pre-market clearance or approval status for the system, correct?
If we were going to distribute the device.
If you were going to distribute the device, where?
Outside of Theranos' clinical laboratory facility.
Okay. So you were aware that you would need to, at least by 2012, that you would need to obtain either approval or clearance status from the FDA before distributing the device to someplace besides the laboratory. Is that right?
That was what was discussed in this meeting, is we engaged with regulatory counsel a lot on that to understand how to interpret the regulations around that.
So I guess, again, without asking about your specific conversations with counsel, around this time in late 2012, was it your understanding that Theranos would have to get approval from the FDA before distributing its device outside the CLIA lab?
We understand, I believe I understood that that was what was said in this meeting.
Okay, what did you understand the FDA required about from Theranos in order to distribute its TSPU as of the end of 2012, whether at this meeting or otherwise? I want to make sure I'm answering your question. What I understood in this meeting was that the FDA representatives there were saying that to distribute our device, we should get the FDA clearance that was commensurate with whatever test we would try to get through the clearance process. Did you have any personal view that was different from what the FDA described for you at this meeting?
So I don't know if that gets into privileged questions. We had very active engagement with regulatory counsel on this topic.
Well, so I think you can tell them what you understood at various points in time. Don't get into the advice that you were given, but you can explain what you're understanding. Huge amount of it's already in the public record through letters from those counsels. So
okay, so my understanding was that there was certainly a belief that a clinical laboratory could use technology within its own patient service centers, even without receiving clearance of the device. We engaged with the FDA a lot on that later, and we ultimately responded to their request that we pursue 510(k) clearance on the device and the tests, and did with our first test.
Is that what you're referring to with the HSV1?
Yes.
So you just said that they requested that you submit 510K submissions. When did that happen?
So we began engaging interactively with them right before we announced our retail rollout, and over a period of months following that initial engagement.
Okay, so that would have been in 2013?
I don't know. I know that in 2013 we sent in a lot of pre-submissions. I think there was initially a focus on those, and then on the nanotainer, and then later to get a test on the device cleared.
Okay, so they requested 510K submissions for the tests you said, the nanotainer, and what was the third?
No, I'm sorry, I didn't say they requested them. You asked when they asked us to submit the device, and I said that I don't know when exactly they asked us to submit the device. I know that after we initially reached out to them to let them know that we would be launching at retail, the first focus with them was on the pre-submissions for the tests. They then requested that we agree to do a 510K submission on the nanotainer, and I know it was after that that they began to focus on the importance of getting clearance on the device, based on my memory.
Okay, so just to move back then, you're saying that you submitted pre-submissions to FDA, they asked for the device, and it was sometime after that that they then requested a 510K submission for the nanotainer.
No, I think the sequencing was first a general discussion about the commitment to work with the agency, even though we were pursuing the model that was described here as an LDT. That manifested in a lot of pre-submissions. As I remember it, initial specific request was to proceed with 510K on the nanotainers, and later there was specific communication that it was important to them to focus on clearance of the device.
Okay, so if you look
With
then,
a test.
if you look then back at the first page of the letter from Hyman Phelps,
Yes.
it looks like there was also a meeting on November 4th, 2013. Do you see a reference to that in the letter?
Yes.
Did you attend that meeting as well?
I don't know, but I think I did.
Okay, what happened at that meeting?
I'm not sure which meeting this was. There was a lot of engagement with FDA during this period.
Okay, well then, why don't we just look back at Exhibit 229. So about halfway down the paragraph, second to last sentence, Theranos has been working closely with OIR for the past 4 months to develop a plan for the submission and review of multiple 510K pre-market notifications to cover hundreds of assays. Those discussions have been extremely productive due to the open communication. So is this what you were referring to earlier as the 510K pre-submissions that Theranos had prepared?
Yes.
Okay. And then it goes on to say, we were therefore very surprised to hear OIR for the first time question whether in the Phase 1 model, Theranos' laboratory testing complies with the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, because in OIR's view, the company is not offering laboratory-developed tests. And here the Phase 1 model, is that the Phase 1 model that you have been describing to us with Walgreens?
I think so. I, again, I don't know exactly what's described in here, but I think so.
Okay. I mean, we can turn to the next page, which is 691 under background. And the second paragraph there talks a little bit about the Phase 1 model, which is that testing is conducted only at the Theranos laboratory on patient samples that are shipped to the facility. So is that consistent with your understanding of what the Phase 1 model was?
Yes.
Okay. So here, it sounds like FDA told Theranos at this November 4th, 2013 meeting that the company was not offering LDTs.
I don't know that they told us that we were not offering LDTs. I think that one of the people in one of the meetings said that they didn't know whether our LDTs would warrant enforcement discretion by the FDA.
Do you remember who that person was?
I believe it was Deposition.
Did anyone at that meeting express any different views from what you recall? At least from the FDA side.
I don't know if it was in that meeting. We had a lot of engagement with division that we worked with, and also with as we went along to try to make sure we were doing the right thing.
Okay. So you just said that there were questions that were raised as to whether your tests would be classified as LDTs.
Would get enforcement discretion as LDTs, as I remember it.
Okay. Did FDA ever tell you subsequently that it didn't consider your tests to be LDTs?
I don't know. There was a large number of interactions with them, and I generally understood that where this came out was that if we continued working with them in good faith, that we would have enforcement discretion.
Do you recall telling prospective investors in 2014 that Theranos' assays were LDTs that fell under FDA's enforcement discretion?
I don't have specific recollections of that, but I know we would openly talk about the tests being LDTs. So
did you also disclose to them that there were talks back and forth and FDA wasn't sure whether Theranos' tests would be considered LDTs?
I don't know. I don't remember specific conversations on this. I believe at that time we'd been operating for a year under enforcement discretion, and so we really believed at that point that we were in good faith operating under enforcement discretion.
I guess at that time in late 2014, is it fair to say you viewed Theranos' approach and plan to take all of its LDTs through the FDA process as sort of a differentiating factor between you and your competition?
We did.
Why is that?
Because no other company that we knew of was voluntarily saying to the FDA that they wanted to take all these tests through the FDA clearance process. And in fact, they were actively campaigning to prevent FDA from regulating LDTs.
And Theranos had taken sort of the opposite approach, filing a comment to pursue FDA oversight over LDTs. Is that correct? And
You can put that one aside. I'm handing to you what's been marked Theranos Exhibit 230. Exhibit 230 purports to be a letter from the Department of Health and Human Services, FDA, to Theranos. The date is June 13th, 2014, with starting dates number TS-0992588. Have you seen Exhibit 230 before?
I think so. I'm not sure.
Do you have any reason to believe that you didn't receive this and didn't review it?
No.
So if you look on the second page of the letter, FDA is now writing to Theranos about the pre-market protocol that Theranos had submitted for review. If you look on the second page, there's a paragraph that starts with based on prior conversations. Do you see that?
Yes.
So FDA writes here, based on prior conversations between FDA and Theranos and documents sent from Theranos to FDA, FDA had understood that you were currently using mostly cleared or approved assays in your laboratory. However, the more complete information you recently sent per our request clarified that the tests you perform are FDA-cleared assays running a Theranos protocol, i.e. modified under the CLIA regulations, or our Theranos assays run on the TSPU. Therefore, most of the tests you're running in your lab appear to be laboratory-developed tests, LDTs, currently under FDA's enforcement discretion, and the rest are tests run on your TSPU that require clearance or approval prior to their use and are not under enforcement discretion. So here, FDA is telling you that first it misunderstood what devices Theranos was using, correct?
This specific person who wrote this memo is saying that.
Yeah. And also that, actually the tests that are run on the TSPU would not be considered LDTs. Correct?
Yes, that's what I understand the sentence to mean.
Okay.
Did you understand that at the time as well?
So I don't remember exactly when I read this, but I know that we engaged with FDA very frequently on the fact that we were running these tests in our clinical lab, what tests, we sent them spreadsheets with exactly what platform was being used and how many tests per month to make sure that we were still in good faith operating under enforcement discretion.
By platform, do you mean device? Or,
Yes.
And did you know? Is it someone you've interacted with?
I think that I started interacting with her to the extent I joined calls on the clearance of the nanotainer after this period of time, but I'm not completely sure. He is our now.
So was he maintaining the relationship between Theranos and FDA during this time frame?
He was one of the people. I think there were others who were also involved, but yes, he was a constant in it.
Were there any interactions that you had with FDA that he was not a part of?
Probably. I don't know any specifically, but there was a lot of interactions with FDA.
Okay, so at the bottom of the page, there is a sentence that starts, therefore. Do you see that?
Yes.
It says, therefore, based on this new information, we recommend that clearance of your capillary tubes and nanotainers be obtained over time as you receive clearance or approval for each individual assay as part of that test system. Please note that without clearance or approval, you cannot continue to ship these collection devices or nanotainers to your sample collection sites for use with tests currently run in your laboratory. So did you understand from FDA at this time that they were telling you that Theranos could not continue shipping the nanotainers from the patient service centers to the Theranos lab because they weren't cleared by FDA?
I think our understanding at the time we got this memo was that they were saying in this memo that there was no way to get clearance, general clearance on the nanotainers if we needed to use LDTs to get that clearance, and therefore we would need to do this. And we immediately began to engage with them on that and on, in fact, proceeding with general clearance of the nanotainers.
Okay, so did you stop using the nanotainers then while you were engaging with them on getting approval or clearance?
No,
Why not?
because we understood following this letter that it was okay to do that if instead of trying to use the LDTs for the clearance of the nanotainer, we actually used commercial machines and pooled the samples, and that's what we ended up doing.
What do you mean by that? Explain that distinction, I guess, between using the LDT and using the commercial machine, just so I understand it.
Yeah, so it's my understanding that what this letter was predicated on was a belief that if we needed to use LDTs or uncleared tests to be able to show that the nanotainers worked, then that would not be acceptable to the FDA as a means to get the nanotainers cleared, because they wanted us to use a test system that had already been cleared for those experiments. So if we were comparing, for example, nanotainer to somebody else's tube and we were using an LDT, they didn't want the LDT for doing that comparison. They wanted us to use a system that was cleared. My understanding is that after this, when we agreed to use commercial machines for that purpose, that there was a path to get the nanotainers cleared, and we began working toward that. And the way that we accommodated that is that to get enough sample to run the cleared commercial machine, you would take, for example, 5 finger sticks from a single person, pool them together to get enough sample, and then you could run the commercial machine to do the comparison between our tube and someone else's tube.
And when you say run the commercial machine, meaning an unmodified predicate device?
Correct.
So why was it your understanding, though, that because you had agreed with FDA to use cleared assays in order to provide this data for clearance of the nanotainer, that it was appropriate to continue using the nanotainer while you were submitting this data?
Because once we agreed that there was a path to get clearance of the nanotainer, we understood that we were in good faith operating under enforcement discretion still.
And how did you gain that understanding?
Based on our ongoing interactions with the FDA.
Who told you that?
I believe there were multiple conversations in which we wanted to make sure that we were okay continuing to use the nanotainer and interpreted the feedback on those conversations to mean that we were.
But who told you it?
I specifically remember a conversation around Christmas Eve in which he had indicated that there was a path with the submissions that we had sent in after this to move toward clearance, that they wanted more data for, I think, 2 of the 3 filings that we'd made, but that we could potentially in the short term get clearance on hematology, and I had asked, wanting to make sure we were continuing to be in good standing, and I interpreted what he said to mean that so long as we continued to work with them, it was okay to do that.
So never told you that you could continue using the nanotainers. You're just interpreting the fact that he said there might be a path forward to clearance as him telling you that you could continue using. Wait, just let me finish. That you could continue using the nanotainers.
I thought that I had asked him on that call, is it okay to, we want to make sure we're doing the right thing and continuing to operate while we're going through this process. And I remember interpreting what he said as being assuring of the fact that so long we continued to work with them in good standing, that that we could continue to operate under enforcement discretion.
Was anyone else on that call?
No, but I remember sending notes to my team immediately after it.
You can put that one aside. I'm handing to you what's been marked Thoroughness Exhibit 231. Exhibit 231 purports to be minutes of a meeting that took place between Theranos and FDA on June 19th, 2014. It's a teleconference meeting, it looks like, and the starting base number is THER-03533763. Have you seen Exhibit 231 before?
I don't remember it specifically, but I think so.
Do you know who drafted these minutes?
I don't.
Did you attend this meeting on June 19th, 2014 with the FDA?
I think so.
What was the purpose of the meeting?
I don't know.
What was his role in the discussions with FDA?
It varied over time. He was our technical expert on a lot of the technology that we worked on and in certain areas, data analysis.
Okay, so why was he being included in this meeting, though?
I don't know specifically. I haven't read these minutes, but I would assume for the purpose of being a technical lead.
Okay, and do you recall if Mr. Balwani attended?
I don't. I don't remember this meeting specifically.
So if you turn to page 4, or 3766 in the document, towards the bottom of the page, about 2/3 down from the top of the page, it says, FDA inquired whether Theranos was sending out the tubes for use at this time. Are the tubes being used in commercial testing? And then again, it says FDA inquired as to whether Theranos was shipping the capillary tubes and nanotainers to the collection sites. Theranos said yes. FDA said that Theranos should not be shipping collection devices for clinical use until Theranos obtains FDA clearance. Theranos should use other cleared collection devices and then transfer the sample to the other containers if necessary for testing at the Theranos lab. So FDA here is telling you unequivocally that Theranos should stop shipping these nanotainers, correct?
I think that was what was said in this meeting.
Do you recall what was said in this meeting? Do you recall that being said?
I don't.
I guess, do you have any recollection at any point in time of FDA telling you specifically to stop shipping the nanotainers in this time frame?
Again, I remember that when the people on the team that we were working with thought that we would not be able to get general clearance for the nanotainers, there was then discussion that we would potentially not be able to use the nanotainer because we could no longer work interactively with the agency toward that. But once we worked through that and moved to the revised model that I was talking about earlier, it was my understanding that we were okay continuing to use the tubes under enforcement discretion.
And when do you think you transitioned to that revised model?
I know that we'd gotten feedback on those submissions by December. I think we would have submitted them months, I think, before that. I don't know exactly when the decision was made to do that.
Are you referring to December 2013 or December 2014?
I think this was in 2014.
And you mentioned a Christmas Eve conversation with
Yes.
Was that 2013 or 2014?
I think it was 2014.
Did you ever tell prospective investors in fall of 2014 that that Theranos was not required to obtain clearance or approval for its testing system?
I don't think we would have said that. I think we talked about our belief that the system was an LDT and that we wanted to take the system and the test through the FDA.
And when you're referring to the system there, what exactly were you referring to as the Theranos system?
In answer to her question, I was referring to the tests that would be run on proprietary Theranos devices.
Okay, so collecting a device from a finger, placing it in a nanotainer, testing it on a TSPU.
Yes. And that's consistent with the clearance and CLIA waiver we got on the HSV1 test system.
Did you ever tell prospective investors that Theranos was seeking FDA approval voluntarily?
I'm trying to remember how we worded it. I don't know specifically how we described it. I think we talked about the fact that we believed our systems were LDTs and that we wanted proactively to engage with the agency on it, on all our tests.
Did you ever tell investors that Theranos was seeking FDA approval voluntarily because FDA approval was the gold standard or the highest standard in the industry?
I think we would have said something like that.
Why would you tell investors that Theranos was seeking FDA approval voluntarily if that wasn't true?
We thought it was.
Why did you think it was?
Because we thought that the testing that we were doing fell squarely within the definition of an LDT, and we knew that that was a controversial field where regulations were evolving, but we engaged with multiple of the top law firms in the country to research that, and we really wanted to take the systems into the FDA and try to get clearance.
But here FDA is telling you that you have to get it approved before using the nanotainer devices and sending them from the patient service centers to the Theranos lab. How does that square with you thinking that approval was voluntary or that FDA wasn't requiring it?
This is specific to the capillary tubes. I was talking earlier about the tests. In response to your question, my understanding is that as I understood the issue with the capillary tubes, there was a period of time in which we were discussing with FDA whether it would be possible to get general clearance at all on the capillary tubes, and that then presented these issues about the inability to use the tubes. And I understood that if we were able to find a way to proceed with getting clearance, then we could continue to operate under enforcement discretion because we would be working in good faith with the agency.
So you're making a distinction here between the tests and the nanotainer device.
Yes.
Did you ever tell investors that FDA thought you needed to obtain approval or clearance for the nanotainer?
I don't remember specific conversations to that effect, but I think we discussed the fact that we were working to get the nanotainers cleared with investors.
Who did you discuss that with?
Again, I don't remember specific conversations about it.
You don't remember?
I don't.
I just want to have a clear sense of your memory of your conversations about the FDA with prospective investors. It was the conversations about the FDA with prospective investors was always about the Theranos system as you just described it, which was proprietary nanotainer, proprietary TSPU. Is that correct?
Yes, about the tests on the TSPU, and specifically the tests, the device and cartridge, and the software, and then also additionally on the nanotainer by itself as a standalone product.
Did you ever talk about regulatory requirements for Theranos' test that it was running on modified predicate devices?
It was our understanding that those were operating as traditional LDTs, and that we clearly would not be distributing those, and that sort of the need for clearance was associated with the distribution of the devices.
So, I guess is it fair to say that your discussions around FDA were about clearance for a system that ultimately included the TSPU?
Yes.
Were any regulatory counsel involved in either this meeting or any meeting talking about the nanotainers?
Just answer that yes or no in the first instance.
I don't know.
Did you share Exhibit 231 with any of your counsel?
Yeah. But that you're now.
Okay,
I think
I'll take that.
that may be an okay question, but I gotta think about that for a second.
Well, Ms. Holmes was just talking about how her understanding was based on things that counsel had told her.
Right, and you said you didn't want to ask her about what counsel had told her, and now you're asking what she gave them to elicit advice, which is an attorney-client communication.
Well,
and you're going to the substance. No, just a sec. Wait a sec, please. You're going to the substance of the correspondence, and you're asking whether she shared it with the lawyer. I'm not saying that I'm going to say no, but I want to understand where we're going with this, because it may be that that's an easy question and she can answer it and we're all fine. It may be that this is the camel's nose going under the tent, and before we get there, I'd like to make sure that I understand what you're doing. That's all.
is your understanding as to whether or not Theranos was permitted to continue using the nanotainer? Was that predicated on any advice that you received from counsel?
How about just asking whether she discussed the use of the nanotainer with the continued use of nanotainer with the counsel? Because you just asked what the outcome of the advice was. I think you can ask whether that topic was discussed with counsel, and you can ask the time frame for it the same way, kind of the same information you'd get on a priv log. And I think that would be responsive.
Okay.
To the
Did you ever
question.
discuss the topic of continuing to use the nanotainer after receiving Exhibit 231 with counsel?
Yes.
Which
Who?
counsel?
I don't know how many different regulatory law firms we had involved at this time, but whoever was acting as counsel, we would have discussed with probably all of them, would be my guess.
And who were your regulatory counsel? Who are you thinking of right now?
I don't know who it was in June of 14. I shared yesterday, I know we started with, and then we went to multiple law firms to get their advice on the definition of an LDT and what could in good standing qualify as an LDTs, and got opinion memos And then I think there were one or two others who we started working with after that. There was a lot of law firms we were asking for regulatory advice on this.
I'm trying to be careful here again, but
Yeah.
did you ever seek any input from counsel about the kinds of disclosures you should make to potential investors about theranos' status with the FDA?
I mean, I understand what you're asking. It's not because
There's probably a better way to ask that question, and I'm open to suggestions. I guess I'm trying to get a sense of, did you talk to counsel about your disclosures to potential investors concerning the FDA?
no problem.
It's yes or no? Or I don't remember.
Yes.
Which ones?
I,
You can give the name of the
okay.
person.
Boyce Schiller.
Who at Boyce Schiller?
David Boyce.
Did you recall the time frame for that conversation?
I mean, I believe he was actively attending board meetings by this point, and we discussed these topics in that context.
I guess more broadly, did you discuss what could be disclosed with potential investors with the board?
I don't know if it was what could be disclosed, but just generally what we were disclosing, yes.
I guess, did you ever share, we talked a little bit about the Murdoch financials before. Did you ever share that exhibit with the board, to your recollection?
I don't know if it was the exact same document, but those general assumptions of the way the retail footprint would ramp, yes.
You can put that one aside. Sure. Let's take a quick break. We are off record at 4:17 p.m.
And this concludes media number 3.